Diary of a Wimpy Kid is one of those special series, one you look back on fondly, and when rereading it still has its charm. But looking any deeper, it starts to become very dark. Why is Greg in middle school? Or why is he such a horrible human? Or why is his family, mainly Manny, so insane? Well, what if I told you all of these questions are one of the same answer in a deep conspiracy that ties all of this series to one force, answering everything from the timeline to the insanity of Manny Heffley, because this child is at the heart of all of it. Let me explain. Let's take a look at Manny's feats, since the real issue here is what this thing can do. Manny is able to speak fluent Spanish even when, according to his very reliable parents, can't speak literal English. This makes no sense, since how in any way could he at 3 years old not just learn a whole language perfectly, which is already basically impossible for his age, but learn one his parents don't even know? Like, did he download a language learning app like Babbel? I'm not sponsored, by the way, I just don't like the other ones, so sponsor me, Babbel. Now carrying on, the kid also rewires the entire electrical system of his home during a snowstorm, which also freezes his family to death. More on that later. But if that's not enough, he built an entire 2-story house right next to his own out of a trash bin of old wood and a toy toolbox. This kid is just insane. He's not normal and not only breaks the laws of physics, but does things that even if possible in his universe, he at 3 years old still shouldn't do. But what does this all mean? What is my theory here? Well, there is no child that could do all of this at the age of 3 years old. There is basically no human of any age who could really, as you can't build a literal house out of toy tools. So the reality we're being shown here doesn't make sense. So I propose we question reality. Who are we viewing the world here through? Well, Greg, he's writing the journals we read. But does Greg actually show an accurate reality? Well, of course not. He's writing the journals for an audience. He assumes they will be read by the masses, making him rich and famous. That means all of Manny's weirdness can be seen as exaggeration, right? Well, that also doesn't really make sense. Greg doesn't really like Manny or any of his family, so why would he give them such insane feats, like building an entire house? If he truly sees his brother as his annoying little brat, some things make sense, like putting a cookie in his game, but saying he knows how to drive a car or use a gun, all canon by the way, don't make sense. So what is the answer then? Why is Manny like this? Well, I do think it also relates to Greg, just not in him being an unreliable narrator. No, instead, it's that Manny is an extension of Greg, being a figment of his own brain and a delusion to punish him. That's right, I'm saying that Manny Heffley is not real. Greg and Manny Heffley. These two brothers are very similar in a way. How so? Well, look deeper into what Manny and Greg share in similarities. They both rarely feel bad for other people, and if they do, it's far more likely for a selfish reason. Whether Greg is sad for Rowley breaking his arm, no, because he's getting all the attention and Greg isn't. They also both hurt people for fun, especially Rowley, which is so sad. Whether breaking his arm or shoving a horrifyingly violent and sharp ball of death into the seat of the kid, these two brothers share a very similar love for violence. They also both survive and do insane things. I gave you all of Manny's feats, but Greg survives tons of things as well. But to take this even further, Greg seems to understand Manny on a very personal level for someone who hates him so much. In the same story where Manny basically almost freezes his family, Greg says word by word, when things get bad, Manny must have figured it was every man for himself. I think he would have let the rest of us freeze to death as long as he had enough time to survive. Not only is that an insane thing to say about your little brother, but also feels very Greg-like. At this point, the similarities are just stacking and stacking, and you probably get what I mean, but so what? Just because these two brothers are similar doesn't mean Manny isn't real or a figment of Greg's brain. No, there is too much of a jump between Manny is weird, does impossible things, and is similar to Greg, to he is somehow a delusion inside the brain of Greg Heffley. But what if I told you there is a single piece of evidence that will entirely prove this theory, and is the whole reason I am making this video? Manny Heffley is everything Greg wants to be. He's a super genius, beloved by everyone around him, fearless being who'd perform any task perfectly, getting everything he wants, which if you pay attention, isn't that far from what Greg wants. Just think about it. The books are always framing Greg as a victim, even though we can see the reality through his words, but who is always painted as the villain? Manny. And because of that, Greg gets to play the victim against someone who represents both everything he wants and what he deep down knows he is. If you need anything more, it is canon that Greg and Manny Manny are both allergic to peaches. I know, case solved. But really, Manny is just Dredd. It lines up too well. But why? Is there any actual reason Dredd is making up his devilish evil little brother? Well, yeah, and it lies in the real timeline of these books. Let me explain. There is one problem with this theory, being if Manny isn't real, then what is the real story going on here? What is really happening? For example, in the snowstorm, did the whole electricity thing just never happen? Or in later books, there are many times when Manny saves the family from horrifying accidents. So, did those events not happen, or is the family actually dead? I thought about this for a while and what the real story of the Diary of the Wimpy Kid is, and I think it lies in why Manny exists. Dredd is a troubled kid. His parents basically hate him, his brother doesn't really like him, and he himself has many bad qualities that I would really say are due to his home life. So just maybe he created Manny as a coping mechanism. At least that was my first idea. On the surface this works, but then why is a bratty mean child who gets away with everything and his parents love more his coping mechanism? Well, that's what he wants to be. I think Manny is a version of Dredd in an ideal form that he has created to fill the gap between him and his parents. And this can be backed up with Manny showing off all of Dredd's traits he himself finds good to him, or even all his desires like being loved or being rich. Manny is always selling his bad art and everyone loves it, just like Dredd wants for his journals. This is my theory, except for one problem. The main issue. What really happened in the snowstorm? And this is where I got an idea. A new theory that is far more twisted and dark, but feels far more true. For it answers exactly why this series suddenly went so insane, with the Heffleys almost always dying and doing impossible things, and it explains why Dredd is still in middle school. Let me explain. If you like the theory so far, please subscribe so you can see more like this, especially because I'm about to start a series on solving different Pixar films, so subscribing with notifications means you won't miss it. Either way, back to the video. Let's look at the snowstorm with new context, because if Manny is Dredd, then maybe he's actually warping his own actions and giving them to him, almost like a form of removing his own guilt. But what does that mean for the storm? Well, I think the most likely story is that Dredd did as Manny did, wiring all electricity and heat to his room, almost killing his entire family. They probably found him all comfy in the heat, grounded him, and the day went on. But that doesn't feel right. No, it's too perfect. So I looked into Dredd's own words again, and well, with new context, oh my god. When things got bad, I figured out it was every man for themselves. I think I would have let the rest of them freeze to death as long as I survived. In the new theory of Dredd and Manny being one, this is the new context of that line. And if you really think about it, it really feels like Dredd defending himself through Manny, because this is what he would do. And well, maybe that is what he really did. That's right, I am saying that Dredd actually did freeze his family to death in the snowstorm. Let's say that Dredd, through selfishness and some poor thinking, rewires electricity and his family just freezes. The whole reason they found Manny was Dredd, so without him, they would have died. It almost feels like Dredd telling us he is responsible, that their life hangs on him. Now, I don't have direct physical evidence he killed his family, since we are viewing things through his false reality in the journals. If we keep reading between the lines, it just keeps building. And well, as the story goes on in the series, we see more and more times when they almost die, and every time Manny is the one to save them. And well, without Manny, they would always die. It very much seems like Manny is a false version of Dredd, that he puts all his faults and mistakes in, but also has all the things he wants. All of this lines up very well, but how does it explain how Dredd is dead, or still in middle school? Well, that's simple. Dredd is not a smart kid, and in reality, once he sees his dead family, he would freak out and run out in the storm, or wait it out till electricity goes, and eventually freeze himself. This is my true theory. Dredd is dead, his family is dead, and he is why. But what comes after that? Well, it's less important if it's really a hell loop, or just the fading thoughts of his dying brain in the cold. I think Dredd created a false reality, one we see through the journals, where he is a victim. One where he can live out his fantasy of always being right and everyone around him being crazy. But his brain is still guilty. He hates himself, so he created a punishment, himself, in the form of Manny. An annoying brat who gets away with everything, who everyone loves even with his faults. A brother who he can put all his sins on, but one his brain tortures himself with. The middle school loop is simply a byproduct, a backdrop for his hell. Because the only way to truly torture Greg Heffley is with one thing he hates, and the one thing he sees as worthy, himself. If you like this theory, I have more coming out, along with a playlist on screen for my previous best theories. Either way, bye!